Hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk. Final briefing of the day, so hopefully everyone's still awake because we have some pretty exciting things. I'll be sharing details about my research into a new attack surface that affects Active Directory environments. So we will be talking about some AD features, some DNS and DHCP features, and we will understand how attackers can abuse those to do some pretty interesting things. So the attack surface that we're going to talk about today has been previously almost untouched by the security community and is largely unknown. And we will do a deep dive into it today and understand exactly how it works. We will be covering a series of attacks that affects Microsoft DNS servers and which enables unauthenticated attackers, so attackers without any credentials, the only thing that they need is access to the network. The attacks enable them to overwrite DNS records. After talking about the attacks, we'll be covering some mitigations to them to understand how defenders can protect themselves against these risks. So a brief introduction. My name is Ori David. I'm a security researcher at Akamai. My background is in red teaming and threat hunting. And today I cover a wide variety of research topics in the Akamai security research team. This is my first time at Black Hat, so hopefully this goes well. And with that, let's get started. Before I get into the research itself, I want to talk a little bit about the motivation behind it, or why we chose to target DNS. So historically, DNS has been abused by attackers in a variety of different ways. So we had, for example, DNS spoofing, where attackers will modify DNS records in order to redirect the communication of their victims. We have DNS tunneling, where attackers will communicate over DNS in order to remain hidden and bypass firewalls. We even have DNS being used to amplify DDoS attacks. And I can go on, but the point is that DNS is everywhere. It has a lot of features, and attackers abuse them all the time. And because of that, I wanted to target a specific DNS feature that I found interesting and that did not receive a lot of attention before that, and that is DNS in Active Directory. So what is that? It turns out that every Active Directory domain requires what is called an Active Directory Integrated DNS Zone, or ADI DNS zone. This is a DNS zone that is used as part of the operation and management of the Active Directory domain. Among other things, as we can see here, it will also host all of the A DNS records for the machines in the domain. So here our domain have two machines, DC 2022 and DHCP1, and we can see that both of them will have their DNS records. Now, an interesting point regarding those records is that we do not need to manually create them, but rather, whenever we add a new machine to the domain, a DNS record would be added automatically. This is implemented by using a DNS feature called DNS Dynamic Update. What this feature does is it enables network clients, DNS clients, to update or create DNS records on the server. So in this example, we can see a machine is sending a dynamic update to the server to create a DNS record for the name pc.aka.test. We can see the type, and we can see the IP address. Upon receiving this request, the DNS server will create the appropriate DNS record. And by using this feature, Windows machines will create their own DNS records upon joining the domain, and they will also update them whenever their IP address changes. Now, this can obviously be a security risk, because if anyone in the network can just access the DNS server and create or modify DNS records, attackers are going to be able to break a lot of things. So we obviously want to avoid that. And because of that, we have an additional configuration, which is enabled by default on Microsoft DNS, called Secure Dynamic Updates. With Secure Dynamic Updates, we take the dynamic update, the same dynamic update process that we had before, but this time we're adding a layer of Kerberos authentication. So this is pretty cool if you're a Kerberos nerd. We actually send the Kerberos ticket inside the DNS message that we send to the DNS server. And the server will first validate the ticket, it will authenticate the user, and only then will it parse the update request. So this prevents just random clients in the network that are not part of the domain from accessing the ADI DNS zone. And there's another interesting thing about secure dynamic updates, and that is authorization. So the second thing that we want to make sure is that different clients in the network, in the domain that are authenticated, are not able to overwrite each other's records. So what we have is that every DNS record has its own ACL, so a list of different objects in the domain and their permissions over the DNS record. And by default, what we have is that whenever a machine creates its own DNS record by sending a dynamic update, it will be granted ownership and permissions over the record. So in the ACL that we see here, we're looking at a machine that is called PC. The DNS record is called PC. And we can see that the PC machine account has write permissions over the record. And again, the idea is that another machine will not have permissions in order to modify this record. Another interesting note regarding secure dynamic updates, which will come in handy later, has to do with non-existing names. So let's say that we have a DNS name that is not already registered in the domain, and we have a new machine that just joined the network and it wants to create a DNS record for itself. So in this case, if the name doesn't exist, every authenticated user in the domain can create its own DNS record, so for a name that doesn't exist. So this is DNS dynamic updates. And while looking at this feature, we came across an interesting DHCP feature. A quick recap. DHCP is a network protocol that enables network clients to join new networks and receive configuration. So let's say I'm a network client, I just joined a new network. I need to know certain things in order to be able to participate in the network. So first of all, and most importantly, I need to know what IP address I can be using, and it needs to be also unique to my machine. I need to know stuff like what is the address of the router, what is the address of the DNS server, and all sorts of other networking configuration. What I can do is I can reach out to a DHCP server, which is a server that is aware of the network, and the DHCP server will provide me the necessary configuration. So an IP address would be given to me that is unique to me, because the DHCP server manages the addresses in the network, and also any other additional configuration that I might need. So this is DHCP. And now we'll be talking about DHCP DNS Dynamic Updates. So this is a DHCP feature that enables the DHCP client to inform the DHCP server of its DNS name or its FQDN and have the DHCP server create a DNS record for it. So the idea is that the DHCP server has just given a new IP address to this new host in the network, and we want other clients in the network to be able to access it. So the DHCP server creates a DNS record. Let's see how this process will look like. So our PC contacts the DHCP server, requests an IP address while specifying its FQDN. The DHCP server will give the client an IP address, and after doing that, it will send a DNS update request to the DNS server. This is exactly the same DNS update request that we have previously discussed, but this time, instead of the client sending the update, the DHCP server is the one that sends it. And as for the data, we can see that a DNS record will be created for the FQDN that was specified by the client and the IP address that was given to the client by the DHCP server. Let's take a look at a quick demo of how this looks like. So here we have a DNS server. Oh, you're not seeing this. Some technical problems are always nice. OK, we got it. So here we have a DNS server, which is also a DHCP server. We can see that we currently have only 2 DNS records inside our DNS zone. And we now go to our DHCP console. And here we can see that we have no DHCP clients. We now go to our second machine, which is a Kali Linux machine. And importantly, it is not authenticated to the domain in any way. So we do not have any credentials at this point. We're going to be using a tool called DH Client. It's a Linux utility that enables us to send DHCP messages while specifying custom parameters. So we will be editing the configuration here, and I previously added the fqdn option to the DHCP message to include the fqdn kali.aka.test. I'm also requesting a specific IP address. This is something that I can do. I'm requesting an IP address ending with 66. So now we run DH client, and we contact the DHCP server, and we have just leased a new IP address. We can see that if we run ifconfig, we see that we got the IP address that we requested. And if we now go to our DHCP server, we can verify that our lease was successful. And in the DNS server, we will see that we have successfully created the DNS record for the IP address that we requested. Now, let's understand a couple of interesting points regarding what we just saw. So, first of all, this entire process, as I said before, is entirely unauthenticated. If you recall, I have previously stated that when secure dynamic updates are enabled, which is the default, you need to be authenticated to the domain in order to create DNS records. But what we've just saw here is that we simply requested an IP address from the DHCP server, which is an action that any client in the network can do without authentication. And what happened was that the DHCP server did the authentication instead of us. The DHCP server authenticated to the DNS server and created the DNS record. And we essentially bypassed this need for authentication. The second interesting point is that this feature, while it is not very commonly used today, is enabled by default on Microsoft DHCP. And finally, Microsoft DHCP is a very, very popular DHCP server. We knew that going into this research, but we wanted to check exactly how. So we used one of Akamai's products called Guardicore Segmentation to map DHCP communication across thousands of networks that we monitor. And we were able to see that in 40% of the networks, Microsoft DHCP was being used. So this attack is going to affect, at this point it's not an attack, it's an attack surface. This attack surface is going to affect a lot of organizations. But what can we actually do with it? So how can we turn this attack surface into an attack? So we know that we have the ability to create DNS records without any authentication. So sounds nice, but how can we actually abuse this? So to understand that, I first want to take a look at two previous attacks that involve name resolution, LMNR spoofing and ADI DNS spoofing. With LMNR spoofing, we will have our victim here attempting to connect to another machine in the network, in this case called pc.aka.test. It needs to know the IP address, so it reaches out to the DNS server. In our case, the DNS server does not have a record, and so the victim will need to try something else. What it will do is that it will send an LMNR multicast, so it will send a message to everyone else in the network and will ask them if they know what is the IP address of the machine pc.aka.test. Now, our very malicious attacker, which sits inside the same local network, will simply hear this request and respond to it, saying, yes, I am pc.aka.test, here's my IP address. And because LMNR is a very bad protocol and it will not verify the response in any way, the victim will simply connect to the attacker without asking any questions. The classic way to abuse this attack would be to get the victim to authenticate to us via NTLM and then perform an NTLM relay attack. So LMNR spoofing has one interesting upside and one interesting downside. So the upside is that it will not require any authentication. We simply need to be present in the network, listen to LMNR traffic, and respond to it. The downside is that it will only work against targets that are in the same local network as us. This is because in order to spoof the responses to the LMNR queries, we need to be able to hear them. So if there's another machine in another network, in another subnet, that attempts to resolve a name by using LMNR, we will simply not hear this query and will not be able to spoof it. The second attack that I want to discuss is called ADI DNS spoofing. Now here we're going to be abusing a fact that we previously mentioned, and that is that for any DNS name that is currently not on the DNS server, so non-existing names, any authenticated user can register their name for themselves. So this time, our attacker will have some sort of weak domain credentials that they will be able to use. We will start exactly the same way. We'll have a fatal name resolution leading to an LMNR multicast. But this time, our attacker, instead of responding directly to the victim, will go to the DNS server, send the DNS update, which is possible because they have some sort of weak credentials, and will create a DNS record for the name that they want to spoof and their IP address. Now what we have is that whenever any machine in the entire domain attempts to resolve this name, they will be directed to our attacker machine. So unlike before, we are no longer limited to targets in our same network, and we can target every machine in the domain. So this is the upside. But the downside is that the attack does require authentication because we need credentials to access the ADI DNS zone. So essentially, it's a mirror image of the previous attack. So with that in mind, I now want to introduce our new approach that I call DD spoofing, or DHCP DNS spoofing. And let's understand how it works. So now we add the DHCP server into the mix. We start, again, exactly the same way, but this time, unlike with ADI DNS spoofing, we cannot go to the DNS server because we don't have credentials. Instead, what our attacker can do is simply go to the DHCP server, request an IP address while specifying the FQDN that we want to spoof, and then, as we know, the DHCP server will create a DNS record for the attacker. So we get the same result as before, where we are able to target every client in the entire domain, because our spoofing happens on the DNS server. But also, we don't need any credentials, because we are simply leasing an IP address from the DHCP server. Now, this attack is pretty cool, and it could be useful in the hand of a capable attacker. But we thought that we might be able to do something even cooler. So up until now, the only thing that we did was create DNS records for non-existing names. What we wanted to try to do was to target existing DNS records of active machines and attempt to modify their IP addresses. So to understand if it might be possible, we first wanted to understand what is supposed to mitigate this from happening. So we conducted a little experiment. We took an existing DNS record, in this case, the record for the PC machine, and we requested the same FQDN from the DHCP server. Now, what we observed next was a pretty interesting behavior. The DHCP server will not verify the FQDN that we give it. So it will not check to see if there's already a DNS record for this name, but instead, it will immediately send a DNS update for any FQDN that we give it. What we saw next was that unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on your perspective, the DNS server will refuse this update. Now, this happens because of the ACLs that we previously mentioned. If we look at the DNS record of the PC machine, we will note that it is owned by the machine account of the PC. And that is because the PC created its own record previously. Whereas when the DHCP server performs the update, it will use its own machine account to authenticate. And because this machine account is not authorized to modify this record, the update fails. So we now know two interesting and important things. We know that the DHCP server will send a DNS update for any name that we give it, and that the only thing that stops overwrites from happening are the ACLs. So if we're going to find a way to overwrite records, the problem would need to be in the ACLs. So I would now like to explain to you about two types of ACLs that we might encounter that have to do with two types of DNS records. So these are not actual Microsoft official terms, but rather they are terms that I use to better explain this concept, so don't go and Google those. The first one is called client records. These are records that were created directly by Windows hosts without any DHCP server involved. The second type is called managed records. These are records that were created by a DHCP server on behalf of another client. So they are therefore managed by the DHCP server. The main difference between these two types of records regarding the ACLs will be the record ownership. So let's take a look. Here we have PC1 and PC2. PC1 will create a DNS record through the DHCP server. Now, we will note that the machine that performs the updates is the DHCP server. And because of that, the owner of the record will be the DHCP server machine account. Whereas with PC2, because the machine sends its update directly, the machine itself will be the owner. So this is the difference between these two types of records, the client and managed records. And now that we understand that, we can go into DD overwrite, DHCP DNS overwrite, the attack where an unauthenticated attacker, the only requirement is access to the DHCP server, will be able to overwrite DNS records inside the domain. We've identified 3 distinct cases where this is possible, and we'll now go over them from the least severe problem to the very, very, very severe problem at the end. The first attack we call managed record overwrite. So managed records, records that were created by the DHCP server. Let's go over some facts that we know by now. We know that the DHCP server doesn't verify the FUDN that we give it. So even if the FUDN is already registered, the DNS server will send an update. We know that the DHCP server owns its own managed records because, well, it created them. And we also know that the DHCP server will use its own machine account when performing updates. Now, if we combine all of these facts, we get to the conclusion that we can make the DHCP server any of the DNS records that it previously created. So this time, we again have the DNS record for the PC machine, but we can see that it was created by the DHCP server. Now, again, we can request this FUDN from the DHCP server. We know that the DHCP server will immediately send an update request, but this time, because the machine account is authorized to perform the update, the overwrite would succeed. And we can now control the IP address of this machine. So this is managed record overwrite. And as for its impact, well, it turns out that it is pretty limited. Now, it's not because the attack will not work. Well, it will work against every managed record that you will find. But the problem is that they are pretty hard to find. By default, modern Windows machines do not rely on the DHCP server to create their own DNS records, but rather they will use DNS updates themselves. So they will have their client records. But in any case where we might find them, we can override them. So, for example, if we have non-Windows clients that do not authenticate to the domain and still use the DHCP server, really, really, really old Windows machines that do not support the update, or simply clients that disable the feature for some reason. The point is, if you manage to find a managed records, congrats, you can overwrite it. But this is still not cool enough. What we want to do is to target the normal Windows machines in the domain. We want to target client records. Now, the problem with these is that each individual client record is owned by its own client. And we, as attackers, are limited to the machine account of the DHCP server when we perform updates. So we have a little problem here. We try to think about certain edge cases or interesting cases where we might be able to do something. And eventually, one thing came to mind. What about the DHCP server itself? Well, the DHCP server is also a normal Windows client. And as every other Windows client does, it will create its own DNS record. See where I'm going with this? We call this attack DHCP self-overwrite. So let's again go over some facts that we know. The DHCP server doesn't verify the requested FQDN, even if it's its own FQDN. The DHCP server owns its own DNS record because it created it, and the DHCP server will use its machine account when performing updates. Combine these, and we get to the conclusion that we can make the DHCP server overwrite its own DNS record. So it will look exactly the same as before. We have the DHCP server record, which is owned by the machine account. And essentially, we're coming to the server and saying, hello, my name is your name. Please create a DNS record for me. And the DHCP server happily does that while inadvertently overwriting its own DNS record. So with this attack, what we can do is we can modify the IP address of the DHCP server and, for example, make it point to our machine. Which means that we can intercept any communication that was destined for the DHCP server. So if there's additional interesting services installed on the DHCP server, we might get lucky. But while thinking about additional services that might be coupled with DHCP servers, one thing that came to mind was domain controllers. So domain controllers can also have DHCP server installed on them. And as it turns out, the attack will work exactly the same way, even if the DHCP server is installed on a domain controller, and will be able to overwrite the DNS record of the DC. And this is obviously a very significant capability because there's a lot of critical information going through the DC. But as it turns out, this is not even the most severe problem here. So if we take a look at any DNS record in the zone and go to the very, very bottom of the ACL, the last line, we will see the enterprise domain controllers group, which is a group that consists of all of the machine accounts of the domain controllers in the domain. We will note that this group will have write permissions over any DNS record in the domain. Now, we know that when we perform DNS updates through the DHCP server, we are using the machine account of the DHCP server. And if this machine account is a domain controller, we get to the conclusion that we can overwrite any DNS record. So this variation I call the DC arbitrary overwrite, and it works exactly the same way. We have the DHCP server, which is also a DC, and now we can specify any FQDN that we want. The record could be owned by any machine account. Because we have this superpower, the DC machine account that performs the update, we will be able to overwrite any DNS record in the domain. Again, without any authentication required. Let's see a quick demo for this attack. So the attack that we're going to be performing, we are going to be abusing this DD override capability to perform an NTLM relay attack. What we're going to be trying to do is to get other clients in the network to authenticate to our attacker machine, and then use NTLM relay to relay the authentication attempt to another machine. So we're going to be targeting the DNS record of this file server here. The idea is that it is a file server in the network, and a lot of clients are going to be attempting to connect to it and authenticate to it. So what we want to do is to change the IP address of this record to our machine. If we take a look at the record, we will note that it is a normal client record. We can see that it is owned by the machine account of the server. The second machine that we have here, called WinSRV, is just a normal Windows machine that we're going to be targeting with NTLM relay. Now we go to our unauthenticated attacker machine, and we start by running NTLM relay while targeting WinSRV, the machine that we previously saw. And now the only thing that's left for us to do is to wait for any machine in the domain to authenticate to us. Now, we don't want to wait, so we'll give them some help. We will use, again, DH client, the same utility that we used before. But this time, instead of kali.aka.test, we will provide the FQDN fileserver.aka.test. We will again be requesting the IP address ending with 66. And now we run DH client first to release our previous configuration. We run it again, and that's it. That's the only thing that we need to do from the attacker's perspective. If we go back to our server, we will see on the DHCP console, we can verify our lease was successful. And if we now hit refresh on our DNS server, we will see that we were able to overwrite the IP address of the DNS record. Again, I know I said it a lot, but without any authentication. And why is this possible? I think I forgot to mention, in this case, the server is also a domain controller. And if we take a look at the last line in the ACL that I previously discussed with you, we will note that the DC has permissions to modify the record. Now, the only thing that's left for us to do is to wait for any client to attempt to authenticate to the file server and to connect to it. Well, it looks like we failed, but if we go to our attacker machine, we will see that that NTLM relay was able to intercept this authentication attempt, to relay it to our target machine, and to execute code on it, dumping its hashes in this example. Now, let's understand the potential impact of this attack. And so First of all, OK, I'll say it one last time, I promise. This attack works without any authentication. We're able to breach into the domain and pretty reliably probably going to be able to use this to escalate privileges. It will work with a default configuration. So nothing needs to be changed. If we have a DHCP server installed on a DC, this will work. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would anyone install a DHCP server on a DC? Well, it turns out that it is a very, very common thing. We examined our data again, and we were able to see that in 57% of the cases where Microsoft DHCP was being used, we were able to see at least one server installed on the domain controller. So again, this is going to be relevant in a lot of environments. As for what can we do with this, what can we do with this arbitrary DNS override capability? So we can use it, as we've just seen, to relay authentication. We can use it to capture sensitive information if we target specific servers that communicate in an insecure manner. We can even do some creative things like block access to other servers in the network by modifying their DNS records. And really, the sky's the limit here. There's a lot of capabilities and things that an attacker can do with this capability. Now, I've just talked about some pretty depressing things if you're a defender or pretty exciting things if you're an attacker. So I want to try to give some hope to the defenders here by covering some of the mitigations that do exist for these problems. The first mitigation is called name protection. Name protection is a DHCP feature that is meant to prevent different DHCP clients from overwriting each other's DNS records. So if you recall, we have previously said that if one DHCP client requests a name from the DNS server, from the DHCP server, there is nothing to stop another DHCP client from requesting the same name and have the DHCP server overwrite it. This is the managed record overwrite attack that we've previously described. So what name protection does in order to prevent this attack is that it will associate each managed record with the original client that created it. And now, if I attempt to overwrite a DNS record that is owned by another client, the DHCP server will not let me do that. This is implemented by using a special DNS record of type DHCID. We can see that when name protection is enabled, along the normal A DNS record, we will have this DHCID value, which is a base 64 value. And this is a unique identifier that is calculated per DHCP client. So it's like a fingerprint, and every DHCP client should have a different DHCID value. So the attack, the mitigation works by verifying these values. So in this case, we have the PC record, which is protected by name protection. And we can see that we have a DHCID value here, which was calculated for the original client that created the record. Now, if our attacker attempts to request the same name, the DHCP server will first calculate the attacker's DHCID value and append it to the DNS update request. Now, as we can see, because the attacker machine is different from the original client that created the record, the DNS server will refuse the update because the DHCID values does not match. So this is how name protection is implemented. I've kind of described it in a high level. I will publish today a blog post that will contain a lot more information about this process. But let's talk about some caveats to this feature. So first, it is only meant to protect managed records. The entire mitigation is not relevant when we're talking about client records. So for example, it will not stop the DC overwrite attack that we've previously described. And the second point, which is kind of depressing, it turns out that it could be bypassed pretty easily. Again, I didn't have time to go into it today, but there's a pretty easy way to bypass this feature, so you cannot rely on it to stop the managed record overwrite attack. The second mitigation is much simpler and much better, and it is called DNS credential. DNS credential enables us to specify an alternative user to be used by the DHCP server when it performs its DNS updates. So If you recall, a lot of the problems that we had before were due to the fact that the machine account of the DHCP server was too strong. So what we can do is we can use DNS credential to configure a weak domain user to be used for these updates. And then we prevent all, both the self-overwrite and the DC overwrite attacks that we've previously described, because the server will not have the strong credentials as before. The caveats for this feature, so it's not like a magic solution. You have to use a weak user. If you use a domain admin, for example, you will still be able to overwrite any DNS record. So I would not recommend that. And it is only meant to protect client records. It will not prevent attacks on DNS records that were created by the DHCP server. And that is because the DHCP server will still use the same DNS credential when it creates the DNS record and when it attempts to overwrite it. So it will not stop attacks against managed records. So I will now like to summarize all of the attacks and the mitigations that we've talked about today. So DHCP DNS spoofing, the attack where we will register non-existing DNS records in order to fool other clients to authenticate to our machine. This attack cannot really be mitigated. That is because at the heart of the DHCP DNS dynamic update feature is the fact that unauthenticated clients can create DNS records. So the only way to mitigate this attack would be to disable the feature. As for managed record overwrite, the attack where we will overwrite records that were created by the DHCP server, again, it cannot really be mitigated. So name protection is supposed to stop this attack, but it could be bypassed. So the only reliable way to avoid this attack is avoid managed records. So if you require them in one of the weird scenarios that I've described before, so non-Windows machines or stuff like that, you should be using static DNS records instead. As for the self-overwrite and the DC overwrite attacks, they are pretty easy to mitigate. Simply configure a weak DNS credential for all of your DHCP servers, and you should be good. We've disclosed all of this information and all of the attacks that we've just described to you today to Microsoft, and their response was that this is cool, everything is as expected. Microsoft claims that all of these things that we've just described are either by design or not severe enough to receive a fix. We tend to disagree. We believe that the attacks that we've described today could affect a lot of organizations, and they can enable attackers to do some pretty nasty things. And so we will be trying to do our best to help, both to protect networks and to raise awareness for this problem. And we will be doing that by releasing 2 tools. So the first tool will be released today alongside our blog post. It is called Invoke DHCP Checkup. It's a partial tool that you can run. It will scan your Active Directory environment, identify DHCP servers, and will identify any risky configurations. Now, spoiler alert, by default, you are vulnerable. So if you're using Microsoft DHCP, it's probably a good idea to run this tool. It will be published later today, as I said before. The second tool that we plan to release in the future is called DD Spoof. It is going to be a tool that will enable performing DHCP DNS attacks, and we hope that it can help security teams to check their networks for these types of attacks. So the key takeaways that I would like you to take from this session. DHCP DNS dynamic updates provide a very significant and a very interesting attack surface, so keep an eye on it. You probably should not be using it, so if you don't need it, please disable it. But if you do need it, there are some cases where it might be useful. Try to avoid the risky configuration that we've talked about today. Before I finish, I would just like to say that we are going to publish a lot of more details today. I didn't have time to cover everything today, so the blog would be published soon on Akamai's blog. You can also find it on my Twitter. And that's it. Thank you very much. I will be available for questions here later. Thank you very much.